The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel and ordered me to sign over every single share of my $24 million company to my sister-in-law. The crowded courtroom held its breath. My sister-in-law flashed a wicked, victorious smile, leaning back in her designer chair, as if she had just conquered the world. I did not shed a single tear. I did not beg. I simply picked up the pen and signed my name. But what none of them knew was that my signature was the trigger to a financial trap so devastating that within 10 minutes, my sister-in-law would be begging for mercy and the corrupt judge would be facing federal agents. My name is Simone. I am 31 years old and I am the founder of Vanguard Biotech. I am also the designated scapegoat of my family. To understand how I ended up dismantling my own blood relatives in a federal courtroom, you have to go back exactly 3 months to the night the war officially began. It was a humid Saturday evening at the Atlanta Heritage Country Club. This was the absolute crown jewel of the city's black elite. It was a place where generations of wealth gathered, where mega-church pastors rubbed shoulders with politicians, and where multi-million-dollar business deals were disguised as casual charity galas. My parents, Pastor Harrison and First Lady Vivian, practically treated this club as their second church. Tonight was the annual charity fundraiser, and the ballroom was a sea of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. I was standing near a towering floral arrangement, completely ignoring the extravagant party around me. I had my phone in my hand, carefully reviewing a highly confidential supply chain contract for my company. Vanguard Biotech specialized in dermatological solutions specifically engineered for women of color, and we were on the verge of a massive national expansion. I was mentally calculating production costs when a manicured hand suddenly darted into my field of vision and snatched the glass of sparkling water right out of my fingers. I looked up to see my sister-in-law, Valerie, glaring at me. Valerie was 33 years old, a former pageant queen, who came from a long line of prominent local politicians. She was married to my older brother Elijah, and she never missed an opportunity to remind everyone of her superior social standing. Tonight she was wearing a glittering emerald gown that cost more than most people's cars. Her hair was styled in perfect, voluminous waves, and her lips were curled into a sneer of pure disgust. "Are you seriously going to embarrass our family table all night?" she hissed, stepping dangerously close to me. I looked at her calmly. "I am standing in the corner, Valerie. I am not even interacting with your guests." "That is exactly the problem," she snapped, her eyes raking up and down my body with blatant contempt. "Look at you, Simone. You showed up to the most important social event of the season wearing a cheap off-the-rack suit. You look like you belong in the kitchen washing dishes, not standing in the VIP lounge. Go out the back door right now before Elijah's real estate investors see you looking like the help. You are ruining our image." I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I simply reached out and gently pulled my phone back from where she had bumped it. My suit was custom-tailored, but it lacked the flashy designer logos that Valerie and my parents worshipped. To them, wealth was only real if it was screaming for attention. "You do not get to dictate where I stand," I told her, keeping my tone perfectly level. "I was invited to this gala just like you were." Valerie let out a harsh, mocking laugh that made a few nearby guests turn their heads. Invited, she scoffed loudly enough for people to hear. "Please, Simone. The only reason you are allowed in this building is because of Elijah's reputation. You are a complete embarrassment. You have always been the ugly duckling of this family, and you know it. You are still bitter that Mom and Dad drained your entire college savings account to buy my engagement ring 10 years ago, aren't you?" Hearing her bring up that specific trauma felt like a physical blow, but I refused to let her see it. When I was 21, my parents had completely emptied the college fund I had been contributing to since I was 15. They gave every single penny to Elijah so he could purchase a massive diamond ring to secure Valerie as his bride. They told me that securing a political family alliance was more important than my degree. When I cried and begged for my tuition money, my mother had coldly told me that with my harsh looks and aggressive personality, I would never find a wealthy husband anyway. They forced me to drop out of college while they paraded Elijah around as their visionary golden child. "Get over it, Simone," Valerie continued, her voice dripping with venom. "You are a college dropout. You mix lotions in a lab like a glorified factory worker. Elijah is a visionary leader. He is managing the family charity and building a real estate empire. He is actually doing something with his life, while you just linger around like a bad smell trying to piggyback off our success. Now be a good little failure and walk out the back door before I have security remove you. I stared into Valerie's hostile eyes. She truly believed her own delusions. She believed she was untouchable simply because she married the golden child. I slowly slipped my phone into my pocket and locked eyes with her. You really have no idea what is happening in the real world, do you, Valerie? I asked softly. Before she could spit out another insult, the heavy feedback of the microphone echoed through the grand ballroom. The master of ceremonies, a prominent local news anchor, stepped onto the brightly lit stage. The chatter in the room died down as guests turned their attention to the front. Ladies and gentlemen, the master of ceremonies announced, his voice booming through the speakers. Tonight, we have broken all previous fundraising records. But before we begin the auction, we must take a moment to honor our diamond sponsor for the evening. This generous benefactor has single-handedly funded the new pediatric wing of the community hospital with a staggering donation of $500,000. Valerie puffed out her chest and adjusted her posture. She leaned toward me and whispered heavily, "Pay attention, Dropout. Elijah's firm is about to be called. This is what real power looks like. Please direct your attention to the center stage." The master of ceremonies continued, clapping his hands together. "We owe a massive debt of gratitude to a brilliant innovator in our own community. Let us hear a huge round of applause for the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Biotech, Miss Simone Vanguard." The entire ballroom erupted into deafening applause. Spotlights instantly swiveled away from the stage and converged directly on the corner where I was standing. The bright white beams illuminated my custom suit. I could hear the gasps of recognition from the elite crowd. Valerie froze completely. The smug smile vanished from her face so fast it was as if someone had slapped her. Her jaw literally dropped open and her eyes darted wildly around the room as the applause continued to swell. She looked at the stage, then back at me, her perfectly contoured face contorting into an expression of absolute shock and horror. "Vanguard Biotech," she whispered, her voice trembling. "That is your company." I smiled warmly at her, my expression radiating calm authority. I reached out and gently plucked my glass of sparkling water right back out of her trembling hand. "If you have time to critique my suit, Valerie," I said, my voice low enough so only she could hear. "I am sure you have time to fetch me a refill. Be a good girl and make it quick. The investors are waiting to speak with me." I turned my back on her, leaving her standing there frozen in humiliation. I walked confidently through the parted crowd, making my way toward the stage to accept the recognition. I shook hands with the master of ceremonies, smiled for the cameras, and delivered a flawless 2-minute speech about the importance of investing in the health and future of our community. I could see my parents sitting at a VIP table, their faces pale and unreadable. I could see Elijah staring at me with a mixture of envy and calculating greed. When the applause finally died down and the gala transitioned into the silent auction, I decided I had had enough entertainment for one evening. I gracefully exited the ballroom and walked out into the cool night air toward the valet stand. The satisfaction of putting Valerie in her place was a sweet feeling, but I knew my family well enough to know that this was not the end. It was merely the declaration of war. As I stood under the grand awning waiting for the valet to bring my car, a tall man in a plain gray suit stepped out of the shadows. He did not look like a gala guest. He moved with a stiff mechanical purpose. "Simone Vanguard?" he asked, looking down at a clipboard. "Yes," I replied, narrowing my eyes. "You have been served," he said abruptly, shoving a thick, heavy manila envelope into my hands before turning around and walking quickly away into the darkness. I looked down at the envelope. The legal seal on the front indicated it was from the Fulton County Superior Court. My heart gave a slight thud. Before I could even break the seal, I heard the sharp, aggressive clicking of high heels storming across the pavement behind me. I turned to see Valerie marching out of the club. Her face was flushed dark with rage and her hands were curled into tight fists. She stopped a few feet away from me, her chest heaving as she pointed a finger directly at my face. "You think you are so smart?" she hissed, her voice shaking with unrestrained fury. "You think a little tech money makes you elite. You think you can humiliate me in front of the entire city and get away with it." I held up the thick legal envelope, tapping it gently against my hand. "Is this your doing, Valerie?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously calm. Valerie smirked, her confidence returning as she looked at the envelope. "Elijah and I are taking back what belongs to this family," she declared proudly. "You used our family name and our resources to build that company. We are suing you for everything you have, Simone, every single penny. See you in court, sweetheart." She spun on her heels and marched back toward the grand entrance of the club, leaving me standing alone in the driveway. I looked down at the legal documents in my hand. They actually believed they could intimidate me into handing over my life's work. They had absolutely no idea the kind of trap they were walking into. I watched Valerie's retreating figure until she disappeared through the heavy brass doors of the country club. The cool wind picked up rustling the leaves of the ancient oak trees lining the driveway. I did not feel fear. I did not feel panic. Instead, a deep, cold sense of clarity washed over me. For years, I had played the role of the quiet scapegoat, absorbing their insults, tolerating their theft of my college fund, and building my empire in the shadows. I had allowed them to believe their own false narratives because it kept them out of my business. But tonight, the shadows had been stripped away. They had seen the magnitude of my success, and predictably, their first instinct was not to congratulate me, but to destroy me and take it for themselves. They wanted to use the legal system to rob me again, just like they had robbed me when I was 21. The valet pulled up with my car. I handed him a generous tip and slid into the driver's seat, tossing the heavy lawsuit onto the passenger side. I started the engine, the quiet hum of the motor grounding me. If Valerie and Elijah wanted a war, they were going to get one. But I was not going to fight them with screaming matches or country club drama. I was going to fight them with contracts, liabilities, and a corporate strategy so ruthless it would wipe their names from the elite circles of Atlanta forever. I pulled out of the driveway, my mind already calculating my next moves. The game was set. I tapped my steering wheel, feeling a strange surge of adrenaline. They wanted my company. I would give them exactly what they asked for. I pulled my car over onto a quiet residential side street just a few miles away from the country club. The adrenaline from the gala was still coursing rapidly through my veins, making my hands shake slightly against the smooth leather steering wheel, but I desperately needed to see exactly what kind of fantasy my brother and his wife had concocted. I ripped open the heavy manila envelope, tearing the thick paper in my haste, and turned on the bright overhead dome light. I scanned the first page of the legal complaint. The plaintiffs were listed prominently at the very top as Elijah Vanguard and Valerie Vanguard. The charges, printed in bold black ink, were completely unhinged. They were suing me for theft of family capital, breach of fiduciary duty, and intellectual property theft. I let out a dry, hollow laugh that echoed loudly in the quiet, dark interior of my car. They were seriously claiming that Vanguard Biotech was a joint family venture. According to their completely fabricated timeline, Elijah was the original mastermind behind my entire business model. The document explicitly alleged that I was merely a hired project manager, a glorified assistant who went rogue and stole his proprietary formulas to start my own competing enterprise. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. They were trying to erase a decade of my blood, sweat, and tears with a few pages of poorly written legal fiction. They wanted the courts to believe that a man who had never taken a single advanced science class in his entire life had engineered complex dermatological compounds. I threw the documents onto the passenger seat and put the car back into drive, pulling smoothly away from the curb. I knew my family was greedy and entirely self-serving, but I had severely underestimated their capacity for absolute delusion. They wanted a brutal war, and they had just fired the first massive shot. I arrived at the Vanguard Biotech Research and Development Laboratory at exactly 6 o'clock the next morning. My lab was a pristine state-of-the-art facility located in the bustling commercial heart of downtown Atlanta. This was my true sanctuary. This was where I had spent countless exhausted, sleepless nights formulating, testing, and perfecting dermatological treatments that actually worked for melanin-rich skin. I was wearing my crisp white lab coat, carefully reviewing the chemical composition of our latest hyperpigmentation serum when the heavy glass doors of the facility swung violently open. I did not even need to turn around to know who had just invaded my professional workspace. The heavy, overwhelming scent of expensive floral perfume mixed with the sharp, rhythmic tapping of a polished wooden cane against the linoleum floor immediately announced their arrival. My parents, Pastor Harrison and First Lady Vivian, had decided to grace my laboratory with their unwanted presence. They looked entirely out of place in this highly sterile scientific environment. My mother was dressed in a tailored lavender suit with a matching wide-brimmed hat, looking fully prepared for a Sunday morning church service rather than a Tuesday morning ambush. My father wore his customary dark-tailored suit, gripping his silver-topped cane with a look of supreme righteous authority. Neither of them offered a polite greeting. Neither of them asked how I was doing or congratulated me on the massive charitable donation I had made the night before. My mother marched straight up to my stainless steel workstation, her dark eyes flashing with indignant fury. "Simone, you need to stop this arrogant foolishness right now," she demanded, her voice echoing sharply off the high ceilings and glass walls. I carefully placed my glass beaker down onto the counter and slowly turned to face them. "Good morning to you too, Mother," I replied, maintaining my calm, professional composure, despite the sudden, uncomfortable spike in my heart rate. "I assume you are here about the absurd and highly defamatory lawsuit your golden boy and his wife filed against me last night." My father slammed his heavy cane onto the floor, the loud crack making the fragile glass equipment rattle on the tables. "Do not speak about your brother with that disrespectful tone, Simone," he barked, his face contorting into a harsh mask of pure anger. "Elijah is trying to save this family from catastrophic financial embarrassment, and you are standing in his way with your stubborn, selfish pride. We did not raise you to be this vindictive." I crossed my arms tightly across my chest, staring intently at the two people who were supposed to protect and nurture me. "Selfish," I repeated the word, tasting bitter and acidic on my tongue. "I built a $24 million company from absolutely nothing, while you two poured every available resource, every dime, and every ounce of emotional support you possessed into Elijah's constant failures. And now you expect me to just hand over my life's work to him without a fight." My mother stepped closer, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest. "You did not build this from nothing, Simone," she hissed, engaging in the exact type of toxic psychological manipulation she had perfected over the last 3 decades. "We gave you $100,000 5 years ago to start this little lotion project. It was family money, Simone. We invested in you when nobody else would even look at your ideas. Elijah desperately needs this company right now to secure his massive commercial real estate loans. He has big international investors depending on his success, and he urgently needs collateral. Sign the business over to your brother today. Besides, women should not be running corporate empires anyway. It makes you look overly aggressive, and it is incredibly unbecoming for a woman of faith to be so dangerously obsessed with money." I felt a cold, sharp rage ignite in the center of my chest, spreading rapidly through my entire body. The level of blatant gaslighting was so extreme, it was almost dizzying. "You are completely out of your mind." I snapped my voice, cutting through her delusional narrative like a surgical scalpel. "You did not give me $100,000. You gave me a pathetic $5,000 loan when I was desperate to buy my first batch of raw ingredients, and I paid it back to you within 6 months with 20% interest attached. The $100,000 you are talking about was the money you secretly mortgaged your own house for to fund Elijah's disastrous crypto startup. You gave him a massive fortune to gamble away on digital scams, and you gave me absolute scraps. Do not ever stand in my laboratory and tell me you funded my success. My mother's face flushed a deep, angry purple, her eyes widening in genuine shock that I had openly called out her blatant lies. "How dare you speak to your mother like that?" my father roared, taking a threatening step forward and raising his cane slightly off the ground. "You are a disobedient, ungrateful child. You have always been bitterly jealous of your older brother. Elijah has extremely heavy burdens resting on his shoulders. He manages the church charities. He manages the entire family real estate portfolio. He needs liquid assets to leverage his powerful position in the community. You are going to call Valerie and Elijah right now, apologize for humiliating them at the country club last night, and sign the transfer documents immediately. If you refuse to obey me, Simone, I will excommunicate you from the family. I will make sure every single member of our massive congregation and every prominent figure in the Atlanta elite society shuns you completely. You will be an absolute pariah in this city. You will have nothing, and you will have no one." I looked at the man who had always valued his public social status over his own daughter's mental and emotional well-being. I stood my ground, refusing to shrink under his towering, intimidating presence. "Go ahead and excommunicate me," I said, my voice dead calm and totally unwavering. "Tell your massive congregation whatever lies you want to invent to make yourselves look like innocent victims. Tell your wealthy elite friends that I am a terrible daughter. But I am not signing over my company. You can take your empty, pathetic threats and walk right out those glass doors because Vanguard Biotech belongs exclusively to me." My father stared at me, his eyes narrowing into cold, dark slits of pure, unadulterated malice. He adjusted his firm grip on his silver cane and gave a slow, chilling nod. "Fine," he replied, his tone dropping to a sinister, quiet whisper that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. "If you will not listen to reason and behave like a proper supportive daughter, we will let the legal system teach you respect. We will see exactly how arrogant you are when a judge formally strips you of everything you falsely claim to own. The preliminary injunction hearing is set for this coming Friday, and just so you are fully aware of your situation, Simone Judge Sterling will be presiding over your case." My heart stopped beating for a fraction of a second. The air in the pristine laboratory suddenly felt dangerously thin and hard to breathe. My blood ran completely cold as the devastating weight of his words crashed violently into my reality. Judge Warren Sterling was not just a prominent, highly respected judge in Fulton County. He was my father's closest fraternity brother and Elijah's godfather. The game was not just unfair, it was entirely rigged. The drive from the Fulton County Courthouse back to my residence felt like navigating through a dense, suffocating fog. Judge Warren Sterling had just orchestrated one of the most blatant miscarriages of justice I had ever witnessed. Without even glancing at the mountain of audited financial records my attorney Darius had prepared, the corrupt judge had slammed his gavel and issued an emergency injunction. My personal assets were frozen. I was barred from entering the Vanguard Biotech headquarters until the trial concluded. He had practically handed my life over to my brother Elijah and his wife Valerie on a silver platter, all while exchanging secretive fraternity handshakes across the bench. I was physically and emotionally exhausted. All I wanted was to step into my sanctuary, lock the heavy mahogany door, and strategize my counterattack in peace. I lived in an exclusive luxury penthouse in the heart of Buckhead. It was a stunning modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Atlanta skyline. I had purchased it entirely with my own money 2 years ago. It was the one place where the toxic reach of my family could not penetrate. Or so I thought. I pulled my car into the private underground parking garage and took the express elevator up to the top floor. The soft jazz playing in the elevator usually calmed my nerves, but today it just grated against the sharp pounding headache forming behind my eyes. The silver doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing my private foyer. I stepped out of the elevator and froze in my tracks. Standing directly in front of my custom-imported double doors were two uniformed Atlanta police officers. Standing right between them, looking like two triumphant vultures, were Elijah and Valerie. Elijah was wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. He had that signature charismatic smile plastered across his face, the one he used to charm wealthy donors at our parents' megachurch. Valerie stood beside him holding a designer clipboard. She was wearing a sleek white pantsuit, looking absolutely radiant with malicious joy. She practically vibrated with excitement as I approached. "What is going on here?" I demanded, keeping my voice steady despite the sudden spike of adrenaline rushing through my veins. "Officers, why are these two individuals standing outside my private residence?" One of the police officers stepped forward, looking slightly uncomfortable but maintaining his professional stance. "Miss Vanguard, we are here to enforce a court-ordered asset freeze and property mandate issued by Judge Warren Sterling this afternoon." I stared at the officer in absolute disbelief. "An asset freeze applies to bank accounts and corporate holdings," I stated firmly, gripping the strap of my leather tote bag. "It does not mean you can evict me from my primary residence without formal notice or a legal eviction process." Valerie let out a loud, dramatic sigh and stepped forward, waving the documents attached to her designer clipboard. "Oh, Simone, you really should read the fine print when you lose a major court battle," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. Judge Sterling was very thorough. His order clearly states that any and all assets purchased with funds derived from Vanguard Biotech are immediately seized and placed under the temporary conservatorship of the plaintiffs. Since you used company revenue to buy this gorgeous penthouse, it is now legally under our control until the trial is over. "This is an illegal interpretation of a preliminary injunction," I argued, turning my attention back to the officers. "You cannot enforce this. My lawyer will have this thrown out by tomorrow morning." The second officer shook his head. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the paperwork is signed and sealed by a superior court judge. We are just here to ensure a peaceful transfer of the property. If you have a dispute, you will have to take it up with the court tomorrow. For tonight, you cannot enter these premises." I looked at Elijah, my own brother, the golden child who had never worked an honest day in his life. He was standing there hiding behind a corrupt judge and two armed police officers to steal my home. "Elijah," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "you are really going to do this. You are going to throw your own sister out into the street." Elijah let out a soft, condescending chuckle. "Do not be so dramatic, Simone," he replied, taking a step forward and adjusting his expensive silk tie. "You brought this entirely upon yourself with your incredible selfishness. I have major international real estate investors flying into Atlanta this week. I need a home office closer to downtown to host them properly. This penthouse is perfectly situated for my business needs. You should be happy to provide this space for the greater good of the family name. Besides, you have been living far beyond your station for years. It is time you learned some humility and remembered where you came from." Valerie walked over to the front door and kicked a large black plastic trash bag toward my feet. The bag split open slightly, spilling out a pile of plain, unbranded sweatpants and cheap cotton shirts I usually wore when doing dirty work in the laboratory. "I packed a bag for you," Valerie sneered, crossing her arms over her chest. "I left all your expensive custom suits and your designer jewelry inside. Those belong to the company now, and therefore they belong to us. I only packed the cheap garbage you used to wear before you stole our family money. We are moving in tonight. Elijah needs his home office. Try a homeless shelter dropout. I hear they have great cots." I looked down at the trash bag spilling onto the pristine marble floor of the foyer. The sheer cruelty of their actions was breathtaking. They were not just trying to take my business. They wanted to strip away every single ounce of my dignity. They wanted to break me down until I was nothing but a helpless, dependent victim begging for their mercy. They wanted to see me broken and defeated. You are making a catastrophic mistake, I told them, looking directly into Elijah's eyes. You have no idea what you are stepping into. Get her out of here, Valerie snapped, turning to the police officers. She is trespassing on our property. The officers stepped forward, gesturing for me to return to the elevator. Miss, you need to leave the premises immediately, one of them instructed sternly. We do not want to have to arrest you for trespassing. I did not argue. I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing me lose my composure. I turned my back on my brother and his wicked wife, leaving the trash bag of cheap clothes exactly where it was. I stepped back into the elevator and pressed the button for the parking garage. The silver doors slid closed, cutting off Valerie's triumphant cackling. By the time I drove my car out of the underground garage, the sky had turned a dark, bruised purple. A heavy torrential thunderstorm had rolled into Atlanta, unleashing a massive downpour. The rain battered against my windshield, matching the chaotic drumming of my own heart. I pulled into an empty parking lot near a local park, cutting the engine. I stepped out of my car and let the freezing rain wash over me. I needed the shock of the cold water to clear my mind. I stood there, getting completely drenched, my custom suit clinging heavily to my skin. I was locked out of my company. I was locked out of my home. My bank accounts were frozen. I was completely isolated and alone in the middle of a massive thunderstorm. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out, shielding the screen from the heavy rain. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. First Lady Vivian. I swiped to answer, bringing the phone to my wet ear. Hello, Mother, I said, my voice eerily calm. Simone. Her voice crackled through the speaker, dripping with that signature manipulative sweetness she used to mask her toxicity. Elijah just called me. He told me about the unpleasantness at the penthouse. Unpleasantness, I repeated. Is that what we are calling illegal evictions now? You left us no choice, Simone. She sighed heavily, playing the exhausted victim. You are so stubborn, so arrogant. Are you ready to stop this foolishness now? Are you ready to apologize to your brother and sign the company over to Valerie and Elijah properly? If you just surrender and sign the permanent transfer documents, we will let you stay in the church basement until you can find a little apartment somewhere. We will even give you a small weekly allowance for groceries. We are your family, Simone. We do not want to see you sleeping on the streets. Do not make us destroy you, Simone. Just submit. I listened to the rain pounding against the roof of my car. They truly believed they had won. They thought they had cornered me, broken my spirit, and stripped me of my power. They thought I was just a naive girl who got lucky with a lotion project. They did not realize I had spent the last decade studying their greed, their vanity, and their absolute financial incompetence. I knew exactly how they operated, and I knew exactly how to dismantle their entire facade. They wanted to destroy me, but they were simply handing me the matches to burn their own empire down into the ground permanently. I will not be needing the church basement, Mother, I said, my voice slicing through the sound of the thunderstorm like a razor blade. Enjoy the penthouse. Tell Elijah and Valerie to get extremely comfortable because their joyride is going to be incredibly short-lived. I promise you that. I hung up the phone before she could say another word. I stood in the pouring rain, perfectly calm, perfectly still. The cold water dripped down my face, but a burning fire raged fiercely in my chest. The trap was set. They had taken the bait, eagerly blinding themselves with their own arrogant pride. I dialed my corporate attorney. Darius answered on the first ring. Simone, he said, his voice sharp and alert. I saw the injunction order from Sterling. It is completely absurd. We can file an emergency appeal by tomorrow morning and get you back into the building. I have already drafted the documents. We can easily prove the judge overstepped his legal authority. This eviction is a blatant violation of your rights. No, I replied, wiping the rain from my eyes. We are not filing an appeal, Darius. We are not going to fight them for the physical property. There was a heavy pause on the line. What do you mean we are not filing an appeal? He asked, confusion lacing his words. They locked you out. They took the property. We have to fight this immediately. We cannot just surrender everything to them without pushing back. They are stealing your livelihood, Simone. Let them have it. I said, a dark smile slowly spreading across my face. Darius, it is time. Activate the poison pill. Let them take the shell. I ended the call with Darius and dropped my phone onto the passenger seat. The rain battered my windshield, but the cold did not bother me. I put the car in drive and pulled out, leaving the glittering skyscrapers of Buckhead far behind me. I drove deep into the industrial outskirts of Atlanta until I found what I was looking for. The Starlight Motel was a dilapidated concrete building with a flickering neon sign and peeling paint. It was the last place anyone from the Atlanta black elite would ever set foot. I walked into the cramped reception area, slapped cash on the counter, and rented a room under a fake name. The room smelled of stale smoke and bleach. The bedspread was faded, and the single lamp cast a sickly glow against the stained wallpaper. It was perfect. If I was going to play the defeated broken sister, I needed the aesthetic to match perfectly. I took a hot shower and changed into the cheap sweatpants Valerie had tossed at my feet. I sat on the mattress and opened my laptop, establishing a secure connection. The illusion of my total surrender needed to be flawless. My family thrived on dominance. If they sensed a fraction of resistance, they would become paranoid. I needed them dangerously overconfident. I needed them intoxicated by their own false victory. My phone vibrated against the wooden nightstand. I picked it up to see new notifications from the Vanguard family group chat. I tapped the screen, and a wave of arrogant gloating flooded my display. Valerie sent a photo of herself lounging on the custom velvet sofa in my penthouse. In her hand, she held a crystal goblet filled with dark red liquid. The caption underneath read, "Finally breathing some real class into this tacky apartment. By the way, Simone, your vintage Chateau Margaux is divine. Thank you for leaving the wine cellar unlocked. That bottle of wine was worth $5,000. I purchased it to celebrate the day I hit 10 million in annual revenue." I stared at the photo, feeling a sharp prick of annoyance, but quickly suppressed it. Let her drink it. She would need a lot of liquid courage for what was coming. A second photo popped up. This one was from Elijah. He sat behind my marble executive desk in the corner office of the Vanguard Biotech headquarters. His feet were propped up on the surface, wearing my noise-canceling headphones around his neck. The caption read, "The corner office finally has a real visionary in the chair. Time to show the world how a true Vanguard man runs an empire. Do not worry, little sister. We will send you a postcard from the top." My mother. First Lady Vivian responded to the group chat with praying hand emojis. "The Lord always restores what is right." She typed her hypocrisy shining through every digital character. Elijah, you look so handsome behind that desk. It is exactly where God intended you to be. Valerie, please make sure the cleaning staff scrubs the penthouse tomorrow. We must remove all negative energy before the church elders come for dinner on Sunday. My father, Pastor Harrison, chimed in next. Simone, I hope this humbling experience teaches you obedience. A woman who defies her family defies God. Repent, and perhaps Elijah will find a position for you in the mailroom. My fingers hovered over the digital keyboard. I wanted nothing more than to unleash truth right into that group chat. I wanted to tell them how pathetically predictable they were. But Darius had given me strict legal instructions. I needed to establish a paper trail of complete compliance. If Judge Sterling accused me of violating his injunction, I needed written proof that I surrendered the assets without a fight. I swallowed my pride and typed a crafted response. I understand. Please just take care of the company. It means everything to me. I hit send and tossed the phone face down onto the bed. The fake submission tasted like ash in my mouth, but it was a necessary pill. I knew Elijah and Valerie were likely high-fiving each other over my perceived weakness. They thought my text was a white flag. In reality, it was the final nail in their coffins. A sharp knock at the motel room door broke the silence. I walked over and peered through the peephole. Standing outside was Desmond. He was a former federal auditor turned private investigator, and the best forensic accountant money could buy in Georgia. I unbolted the door and let him inside. Desmond stepped into the room, his sharp eyes scanning the peeling wallpaper and stained carpet with amusement. He placed a locked metal briefcase onto the small table near the window. "I have seen you operate in luxury boardrooms and high-end restaurants, Simone," he said, taking off his trench coat. "This aesthetic is definitely a new direction for you." "I need to stay off the grid, Desmond," I replied, pulling up a chair. "My family has eyes all over Buckhead and downtown. If they see me sitting in a luxury suite making power plays, they will know I am planning something. Right now, they need to believe I am crying over my ruined life." "Did you bring the financial traces I asked for?" Desmond unlatched his briefcase and pulled out thick stacks of paper covered in dense spreadsheets and highlighted banking transactions. I brought everything, he said, his expression turning serious. "And Simone, you were right to trust your instincts. None of this hostile takeover makes any logical sense. Your brother and his wife did not just wake up yesterday and decide to steal a biotech firm out of jealousy. They are operating out of pure desperation." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "Show me the money trail," I demanded. "Elijah runs a highly successful commercial real estate firm and manages the Vanguard Family Charity Fund. My parents brag about his massive wealth every Sunday from the pulpit. Why is he suddenly so desperate for my company that he would risk using a corrupt judge to steal it?" Desmond spread the documents across the table, illuminating the chaotic financial reality hiding behind my brother's pristine public image. "Elijah's real estate firm is a complete illusion," he explained, tapping a column of negative numbers. "He has not closed a legitimate commercial property deal in over 4 years. Every single one of his luxury developments has stalled due to permit issues and mismanagement. But he refused to downgrade his lifestyle. He and Valerie have been living like royalty, buying luxury cars, throwing exorbitant parties, and funding her family's political campaigns, all on lines of credit." I scanned the documents, my eyes widening at the sheer volume of high-interest loans. "He has millions of dollars in debt," I realized aloud. "How is he even keeping the creditors at bay? Why have they not forced him into bankruptcy yet?" "Because he stopped borrowing from legitimate banks a long time ago," Desmond said, his voice dropping. "Elijah got desperate. He started taking massive unrecorded loans from private equity syndicates. We are talking about dangerous underground creditors who do not care about court orders or bankruptcy filings. They care about liquid cash and demand immediate repayment. 2 weeks ago, these creditors issued a final ultimatum. Elijah has to produce $15 million in verifiable assets, or they will dismantle his entire life piece by piece." I sat back in the plastic chair, my mind racing to process the magnitude of his stupidity. $15 million, I repeated. He owes dangerous people $15 million and has zero liquidity to cover it. That is why they came after Vanguard Biotech. They need a profitable company to hand over to the creditors as collateral to save their own skins. Exactly. Desmond nodded. "But it gets worse, Simone. You asked me to look into how he has been making minimum interest payments on these underground loans for the past 2 years. If his business is failing and his credit is maxed out, where was the cash coming from?" Desmond pulled a redacted bank ledger from the bottom of his briefcase and pushed it across the table toward me. I looked down at the highlighted routing numbers. The accounts listed belonged to the Vanguard Family Church Charity Fund. The exact fund my parents managed, the fund that received millions of dollars in donations from our faithful congregation every single year to build community centers and support local youth programs. I stared at the ledger, the truth hitting me. "He is stealing from the church," I whispered, feeling a wave of nausea. "Elijah is embezzling millions from the charity fund to pay off his gambling debts and underground loans. Your brother is not just a golden boy, Simone. He is a federal criminal. And your parents' megachurch is going down with him." Desmond handed me the heavily redacted bank ledger. His words echoed in the tiny motel room. "Elijah isn't just a golden boy, Simone. He's a federal criminal. And your parents' megachurch is going down with him." I took the ledger from Desmond, my hands steady, despite the earthquake detonating in my mind. I scanned the pages. The columns of numbers told a story of absolute recklessness and profound greed. Elijah had been transferring millions of dollars from the Vanguard Family Church Charity Fund directly into shell companies. Those shell companies then funneled the cash straight to his underground creditors. This was not a minor accounting error or a temporary lapse in judgment. This was a systematic, highly organized embezzlement scheme. My brother, the man my parents paraded as the epitome of moral virtue, the man they deemed worthy of my hard-earned $24 million company, was a desperate thief drowning in a $15 million ocean of illegal debt. Desmond tapped his pen against the cheap table. He has been doing this for over 2 years, Simone. The real estate market shifted, his luxury development stalled, and instead of admitting failure and restructuring his business, he doubled down. He took high-interest loans from private equity syndicates, shadow lenders, who operate completely outside the law. When those loans came due, he panicked. He used his position as the charity fund manager to siphon off donations meant for the community center and the scholarship programs. I stared at the ledger, my mind rapidly piecing together the timeline. He needed to show these creditors massive, verifiable assets. I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He needed collateral to stop them from coming after him personally. That is why he sued me. He wants to hand Vanguard Biotech over to them to clear his $15 million debt. Exactly, Desmond confirmed. Your company is his lifeline. If he doesn't secure those assets within 60 days, these creditors won't just ruin his reputation. They will ruin his life. They will seize everything he owns, and they won't stop with him. A chilling thought struck me, and I looked up at Desmond. What about Valerie? Does she know? Desmond let out a sharp, cynical laugh. Valerie isn't just an innocent bystander, Simone. She is a highly active participant. Let me show you the secondary money trail. He pulled another folder from his briefcase and pushed it toward me. I opened it to find a stack of credit card statements and bank transfer records. They were all in Valerie's name. While Elijah was funneling money to his creditors to stay alive, Desmond explained, his tone laced with disgust, Valerie was funneling money to maintain her status as the queen of Atlanta's black elite. She has been using a secondary account linked directly to the embezzled church funds to finance her entire lifestyle. I flipped through the statements, feeling a mixture of horror and cold, hard satisfaction. The evidence was irrefutable. There were massive charges for custom designer wardrobes, luxury vehicles, extravagant vacations, and high-end jewelry. But it wasn't just personal vanity. There were also significant, repeated transfers to political action committees and campaign funds. She has been using the stolen charity money to fund her family's political campaigns. I realized, tracing a $50,000 transfer to a mayoral candidate her father endorsed. She is buying political influence with money meant for underprivileged youth. She is building a dynasty on stolen funds, Desmond agreed. She needs Elijah's facade of success just as much as he does. Without his supposed wealth, her political ambitions crumble and her social standing evaporates. They are completely codependent in this fraud. If he goes down, she goes down with him. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with breathtaking clarity. The hostility at the country club, the sudden vicious lawsuit, the rapid illegal eviction from my penthouse. It wasn't just about jealousy or a desire to humiliate me. It was about survival. They were terrified, cornered animals lashing out at the only viable escape route they could find. Vanguard Biotech was their life raft, and they were willing to drown me to take it. I leaned back in my chair, processing the sheer magnitude of their deception. For years, I had believed their cruelty stemmed from simple, petty favoritism. I believed they looked down on me because I didn't fit their mold of perfection. But the truth was far more sinister. They looked down on me because they were desperate to elevate themselves above their own rotting, corrupt foundation. They needed me to be a failure so they could continue pretending to be a success. This is why they want the company so badly, I said, my voice cold and steady. They don't care about the science. They don't care about the products. They just need the $24 million valuation to appease their creditors and keep the feds away from the church fund. That is exactly right, Desmond said. But the situation is even more precarious than it appears. The creditors are losing patience. Elijah has stalled them by promising that he is on the verge of acquiring a massive tech company. If he doesn't deliver Vanguard Biotech soon, the syndicate will foreclose on his debts, and the entire embezzlement scheme will be exposed to the authorities. I looked at the documents spread across the table. The evidence was damning. It was enough to send both Elijah and Valerie to federal prison for decades. It was enough to destroy my parents' megachurch and their entire social standing in Atlanta. The power I held in my hands at that moment was absolute. I could pick up the phone, call the FBI, and watch my family's empire burn to the ground before the sun came up. But that would be too easy. That would be too quick. They had spent years slowly, methodically trying to destroy my self-worth. They had stolen my college fund. They had mocked my ambitions. They had thrown me out of my own home and tried to erase my life's work. A simple phone call to the authorities wouldn't give them the reckoning they truly deserved. I wanted them to feel the exact same sense of helpless, agonizing defeat they had tried to inflict upon me. I wanted them to orchestrate their own downfall. I need to know everything about these creditors. I told Desmond, my mind already formulating a strategy that was both legally sound and brutally effective. I need names, contact information, and the exact structure of Elijah's debt portfolio. If they want $15 million, I need to know exactly how to give it to them. Desmond smiled a slow, appreciative grin. I have all of that right here, he said, tapping a thick file folder. But before we get into the details of the syndicate, there is one more critical piece of information you need to see. This is the piece that ties everything together. This is why Elijah was able to secure that injunction so quickly and why he is so confident he will win this lawsuit. He reached into his briefcase one final time and pulled out a single thin file. He didn't slide it across the table. He held it out to me, his expression turning deadly serious. You are going to want to see who helped Elijah launder the charity money offshore, Desmond said softly. Because your brother didn't set up those Cayman Island shell companies by himself. He had high-level legal assistance. I took the file from him, a cold sense of dread settling in the pit of my stomach. I opened it and reviewed the documents inside. They were bank transfer records tracing a highly sophisticated laundering operation. The money flowed from the Vanguard Family Church Charity Fund into Elijah's real estate firm, then through a series of anonymous LLCs before finally landing in a secured offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I flipped to the final page, searching for the name associated with that offshore account. When I saw it, the breath caught in my throat. The name printed in bold black letters was not Elijah's. It was not Valerie's. It was Judge Warren Sterling, the corrupt judge presiding over my case. The man who had frozen my assets and barred me from my own company without looking at a single piece of evidence. Elijah's godfather, my father's fraternity brother. Judge Sterling was not just a biased family friend. He was an active co-conspirator in a massive federal embezzlement scheme. He was receiving a direct cut of the stolen charity funds funneled into his offshore account as a kickback for protecting Elijah's interests and facilitating his illegal activities. The entire legal battle was a sham. The lawsuit, the injunction, the upcoming trial. It was all a carefully choreographed performance designed to legally transfer my $24 million company into Elijah's hands so he could pay off his creditors and ensure the kickbacks to Judge Sterling continued uninterrupted. They were using the justice system as a weapon of theft, and the man wielding the gavel was the biggest thief of them all. I slowly closed the file, the absolute magnitude of their corruption finally crystal clear. They believed they held all the cards. They believed they had outsmarted me, outmaneuvered me, and backed me into an impossible corner. They believed I was just a naive, helpless scapegoat ready to be sacrificed for the preservation of their elite facade. They were about to learn a very painful lesson about the woman they had underestimated for her entire life. Desmond, I said, my voice calm, precise, and lethally focused, I want you to initiate contact with Elijah's creditors immediately. Do it quietly. Do it completely off the grid. Tell them you represent an anonymous buyer interested in purchasing Elijah's entire $15 million debt portfolio. Desmond's eyes widened slightly, understanding dawning on his face. You are going to buy his debt. I am going to own his debt, I corrected him. I am going to become his sole creditor. And then, I am going to let him win his lawsuit. I am going to let him take Vanguard Biotech. Desmond leaned back in his chair, a look of profound respect crossing his features. You are going to let them steal a shell company. I'm going to let them steal a trap, I said, a cold smile finally breaking through. They want to play corporate games. Let's see how they handle a $15 million poison pill. Section 7. Exactly 1,500 words. Desmond stared at me across the small, scratched motel table, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound professional respect. A poison pill, he repeated slowly, letting the heavy weight of the financial terminology settle into the damp air of the room. You are going to intentionally burden your own company with $15 million of toxic debt just to trap your brother and his wife. I shook my head, my gaze dropping back down to the heavily redacted bank ledgers spread out before us. I am not burdening my company, Desmond. I am burdening a physical shell that they are desperate to steal. But before we execute that maneuver, I need to understand the exact anatomy of this corruption. I need to know exactly how deep the rot goes with Judge Sterling. Show me the rest of the offshore money trail. Desmond reached into his metal briefcase and pulled out a separate, incredibly thin manila folder. He opened it carefully, revealing copies of international wire transfers that looked completely different from Elijah's domestic banking records. When Elijah started embezzling from the Vanguard Family Church Charity Fund, he knew he could not just dump millions of dollars directly into his personal checking account, Desmond explained, tracing his finger along a complex flowchart he had drawn. He needed a sophisticated washing machine, so he set up a series of anonymous limited liability companies here in Georgia. He funneled the church donations into these domestic companies under the guise of fake real estate development grants. I followed his finger across the page, my stomach churning at the calculated deception. My parents' congregation was filled with hardworking working-class people who tithed 10% of their modest incomes, believing they were funding youth centers and food banks. Instead, their sacrifices were funding Elijah's fraud and Valerie's designer wardrobe. From those domestic companies, Desmond continued, the money was wired to a highly secure offshore shell corporation located in the Cayman Islands. This specific shell corporation is completely insulated from standard United States tax audits. It is a financial black hole. But here is the critical part, Simone. Elijah does not own that Cayman Islands shell corporation. He is just the depositor. I leaned forward, my eyes narrowing as I scrutinized the international routing documents. If Elijah does not own the offshore account, then who is the primary beneficiary? Desmond flipped to the final page of the folder. I looked down at the highlighted name printed in bold black ink. Judge Warren Sterling. A cold, heavy silence descended upon the dingy motel room. The air felt thick and suffocating. Judge Sterling was not just a biased family friend rendering unfair legal judgments to help his fraternity brother out of a jam. He was an active, knowing participant in a massive federal financial crime syndicate. Look at the percentages, Desmond said, tapping the specific deposit amounts on the financial statements. Every single time, Elijah transferred a batch of stolen charity funds out of the country, exactly 10% of that money was diverted directly into Sterling's Cayman Island account. It is a systematic, organized kickback structure. Elijah has been paying Sterling a 10% protection fee for years to ensure his real estate scams never faced legal scrutiny. The horrifying reality of the situation washed over me with absolute clarity. This was the exact reason Judge Sterling had issued that emergency injunction against me with such unprecedented speed. He had not barred me from Vanguard Biotech and frozen my personal assets simply because my father asked him to protect the family name. He did it because he was absolutely terrified. Sterling knew that Elijah was drowning in $15 million of debt to dangerous underground creditors. He knew that if those creditors destroyed Elijah, the entire embezzlement scheme would unravel, and the federal government would inevitably trace the stolen church funds right back to his offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. If Elijah goes down, Judge Sterling goes down with him. I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Sterling needs Elijah to steal Vanguard Biotech so Elijah can pay off the syndicate and keep the money laundering operation a secret. My company is the only thing standing between an Atlanta Superior Court judge and a federal prison sentence. Desmond nodded grimly, closing the file and sliding it across the table toward me. Your entire legal battle is a complete sham, Simone. The lawsuit, the injunction, the upcoming trial, it is all a carefully choreographed performance. They are using the justice system as a weapon of theft to cover up a multi-million-dollar racketeering conspiracy. You are not fighting a family dispute in a court of law. You are fighting a criminal cartel, and the cartel owns the judge. I stood up from the cheap plastic chair and paced across the stained carpet of the motel room. The anger I felt was no longer hot and explosive. It had transformed into something freezing cold and highly calculating. My family had sold their souls for social status and designer clothes. They had hidden behind their religion, their country club memberships, and their elite reputation while actively robbing their own community. And they expected me to happily pay the ultimate price for their sins, simply because I was the unmarried daughter they always deemed unworthy. Pack up everything, Desmond, I commanded, turning back to face him with renewed purpose. Make highly secure digital copies of every single ledger, every wire transfer, and every offshore account routing number. I need you to initiate contact with Elijah's underground creditors immediately. Do it quietly and completely off the grid. Tell them you represent an anonymous buyer interested in purchasing Elijah's entire $15 million debt portfolio. Desmond began gathering the documents, locking them safely back inside his heavy metal briefcase. And what are you going to do, Simone? I am going to meet with my corporate attorney, I replied, grabbing my coat from the bed. It is time to prepare the poison pill. 2 hours later, I sat in the dimly lit soundproof conference room of a private executive club in downtown Atlanta. I had chosen this location specifically because it required top-tier security clearance and was completely insulated from the prying eyes of the Atlanta black elite. Sitting across the polished mahogany table from me was Darius Thorne. Darius was a ruthless, brilliant corporate attorney who specialized in hostile takeovers and complex mergers. He was a shark in a tailored suit, and he was fiercely loyal to me. I slid a secure, encrypted tablet across the table toward him. Darius opened the files and spent the next 30 minutes reading through Desmond's forensic accounting reports in absolute silence. I watched his sharp eyes dart across the screen, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the fraud, the embezzlement, and the judicial corruption that my family had orchestrated. When he finally finished reading, Darius slowly set the tablet down and took a deep breath. His face was a mask of cold, professional fury. Simone, he set his voice tight with restrained anger. This is the most extensive network of financial crimes I have seen in my entire career. Your brother and your sister-in-law are looking at decades in federal prison. And Judge Sterling is going to lose his robe, his pension, and his freedom the second this information sees the light of day. I know, I replied, leaning back in my leather chair. But right now Sterling holds the gavel. He controls the narrative in that courtroom. He has the power to strip me of my company legally and hand it directly to Valerie and Elijah under the guise of restoring family capital. Darius shook his head firmly, tapping his pen on the table. We take this evidence straight to the Federal Bureau of Investigation right now. We bypass the local courts entirely. We file a federal racketeering complaint, and we let the authorities tear your family and that corrupt judge apart. We do not even bother showing up to Sterling's kangaroo court on Friday. I held up my hand, stopping him. No, Darius. If we go to the feds right now, Elijah and Valerie will panic. They will try to flee, or they will find a way to destroy the remaining evidence. They will play the victim, and my parents will use the church resources to hire high-powered defense attorneys to drag this out for years. My parents will spin a narrative that I am a jealous, vindictive daughter trying to destroy the family ministry because I am bitter about my past. I will not allow them to play the victim card. I want them to feel the exact same sense of helpless, agonizing defeat they have tried to inflict upon me. I want them to orchestrate their own spectacular downfall in public. Darius narrowed his eyes, studying my face carefully. You cannot win in a rigged courtroom, Simone. Sterling will never let you present this evidence. He will suppress everything and order the transfer of your assets to save his own skin. You cannot play fair against a judge who is actively stealing from your family church. I am not going to play fair, Darius, I said, a dark smile touching the corners of my mouth. I am going to let them win. Darius leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany table. Let them win, he repeated, profound skepticism lacing his tone. You want to walk into that courtroom and just hand Valerie and Elijah the keys to a $24 million empire. I want to hand them a loaded weapon disguised as an empire, I corrected him. You and I both know how Vanguard Biotech is actually structured, Darius. My family thinks they are stealing a massively profitable company. They think they are stealing all my assets, my patents, and my bank accounts. But they are completely blind to the corporate reality of how my business operates. Darius paused, his eyes widening slightly as the realization began to dawn on him. He sat back in his chair, letting out a low whistle of absolute amazement. The Delaware Holding Company, he murmured, a predatory grin spreading across his face. You want to trigger the holding company traps? Exactly, I nodded, feeling the satisfying thrill of the strategy locking into place. We are going to let Judge Sterling rule against me. We are going to let Valerie and Elijah experience the ultimate victory. I am going to walk into that courtroom and legally sign Vanguard Biotech over to my sister-in-law. But the moment my signature hits that paper, they are not acquiring wealth. They are acquiring $15 million of immediate toxic liability. Darius looked at me, his expression a mixture of awe and serious caution. Are you sure about this, Simone? He asked, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. If we do this, you are effectively signing over Vanguard Biotech. You are handing your enemies the very entity you built from nothing. I looked at my brilliant attorney, feeling no hesitation, no fear, and absolutely no remorse. I smiled coldly, staring straight into his eyes. I am signing over a name, Darius, I replied, my voice echoing with pure, lethal certainty. I am keeping the soul. Now draft the transfer documents. Let us go give my family exactly what they deserve. Darius stared at me across the wide expanse of the polished mahogany table. The ambient lighting of the private executive club caught the sharp angles of his face as he processed the magnitude of what I had just said. He slowly closed his encrypted tablet, placing it face down on the table. He folded his hands together, leaning forward with an expression of profound professional curiosity. Explain the structure to me, Simone, he said, his voice completely devoid of its usual aggressive corporate edge. I have reviewed your quarterly earnings and your public tax filings. Vanguard Biotech is valued at $24 million. It is a highly lucrative, heavily capitalized entity. How exactly are you planning to hand that over to your brother and sister-in-law without losing your entire net worth in the process? I leaned back in my leather chair, savoring the absolute brilliance of the trap I had set years ago. When I first started formulating dermatological solutions in my tiny apartment, I knew my family would eventually come for my success. I grew up in a household where my parents constantly stripped me of my resources to fund Elijah's extravagant lifestyle. They drained my college savings to buy Valerie a diamond ring. They conditioned me to expect theft masked as family obligation. So when Vanguard Biotech began to generate serious revenue, I did not just hire accountants. I hired architects of corporate defense. I built a fortress disguised as a cosmetics company. Darius nodded slowly, encouraging me to continue. The company that Elijah and Valerie are suing me for, I explained, keeping my tone perfectly measured. The entity known publicly and legally as Vanguard Biotech is nothing more than an operating shell. It is the public-facing entity that pays the employees' signs, the warehouse leases, and distributes the final products to our retail partners. It handles the daily logistics and the physical manufacturing processes. It looks incredibly wealthy on paper because of the massive revenue flowing through its accounts every single month. But it does not actually own anything, does it? Darius asked, a sharp, predatory smile beginning to form on his lips. It owns absolutely nothing, I confirmed, leaning forward to meet his gaze. Every single patent, every proprietary skincare formula engineered for melanin-rich skin, every exclusive manufacturing contract, and the Vanguard Biotech trademark itself belongs to a completely separate entity. 5 years ago, I established a highly secure anonymous holding company incorporated in the state of Delaware. The privacy laws in Delaware are notoriously strict, shielding the identity of the primary shareholders from public records and state-level litigation. Darius let out a low, appreciative laugh. And you control 100% of the shares in this Delaware holding company. Every last one, I said, my voice ringing with cold satisfaction. The holding company is the true vault. It holds the soul of the business. The Atlanta-based operating company, the one Elijah is trying to steal, simply leases the rights to use those patents and trademarks from my Delaware holding company. Vanguard Biotech pays a massive licensing fee every quarter just to legally manufacture and sell the products I invented. Elijah and Valerie are completely blinded by their greed. They are looking at the $24 million valuation of the operating company and drooling over the profit margins. They do not understand that the operating company is entirely dependent on the goodwill of an anonymous corporate landlord. Darius immediately grabbed his expensive fountain pen and pulled a fresh legal pad toward him. The legal possibilities were unfolding rapidly in his mind. So if Judge Sterling orders you to surrender your shares in the operating company, he is essentially handing your brother a beautifully wrapped empty box. Exactly, I replied. But an empty box is not enough of a punishment for what they have done. They did not just try to steal from me, Darius. They conspired with a corrupt superior court judge to orchestrate a hostile takeover. They dragged me through the mud at the country club. They illegally evicted me from my penthouse and threw my belongings into the street. They want to play the roles of ruthless corporate titans. I want to give them the full, terrifying experience of corporate liability. I want to build a poison pill into the transfer documents so toxic it will financially annihilate them the second the ink dries. Darius began writing furiously, his pen flying across the yellow legal pad. We need to draft a hyper-specific termination clause, he murmured, his eyes focused intently on the page. We will embed it deep within the operating company's bylaws and tie it directly to the licensing agreements with your Delaware holding company. The trigger mechanism needs to be absolute. What kind of trigger, I asked, watching my attorney work his legal magic. A hostile transfer of control clause, Darius explained, looking up at me with eyes full of dangerous excitement. We will stipulate that if the controlling shares of the operating company are ever transferred through an involuntary mechanism, such as a hostile corporate takeover or specifically a judicial court order, all existing licensing agreements immediately and permanently dissolve. I smiled, feeling the trap snapping shut in my mind. So the second Judge Sterling bangs his gavel and forces me to sign the company over to Valerie. The operating company instantly loses the legal right to manufacture, sell, or distribute a single bottle of product. Yes, Darius confirmed, circling a paragraph on his notepad. The company will instantly lose its entire product line, its brand name, and its revenue stream. But we can take this a step further, Simone. You mentioned wanting to punish them with corporate liability. We can draft an assumption of debt clause. Explain it to me. I said, my heart beating faster with anticipation. When control of an operating company is forcibly transferred, the new owners do not just acquire the assets. They inherit the existing corporate liabilities, Darius said, his voice sharp and precise. We can structure the bylaws so that upon a hostile transfer of ownership, the operating company immediately assumes full legal and financial responsibility for any outstanding corporate debt assigned to it by the previous majority shareholder. That means you can attach massive external debts to Vanguard Biotech right before you sign it away. Once Valerie and Elijah take ownership, the corporate veil will not protect them from creditors if they attempt to dissolve the company to avoid paying. They will be on the hook. The sheer brilliance of the strategy was intoxicating. We were going to turn their greed into their own personal financial guillotine. They wanted my company to pay off Elijah's dangerous underground creditors. They believed Vanguard Biotech was their golden ticket out of a $15 million hole. I was going to make sure that golden ticket became a concrete block tied directly to their ankles. Draft the clauses immediately, Darius the First commanded, standing up from the heavy mahogany table. Make the legal language incredibly dense and bury it deep within the transfer documents. Judge Sterling is so arrogant and so desperate to secure his offshore kickbacks that he will never bother to read the fine print. He will just force me to sign the papers to close the case as quickly as possible. Darius stood up, gathering his notes and sliding them into his leather briefcase. Consider it done, Simone. I will have my team work through the night to ensure the poison pill is completely ironclad. But you need to acquire the debt to attach to the company. Do you have a specific liability in mind? I pulled my smartphone from my coat pocket, unlocking the secure financial application connected directly to my offshore wealth management team. I had spent the last 5 years quietly multiplying my profits through aggressive international investments. I had more than enough liquid capital to execute this final devastating maneuver. Elijah owes $15 million to a syndicate of ruthless private equity lenders, I told Darius, my voice steady and resolute. He embezzled from our parents' megachurch charity to pay the interest, but the principal loan is coming due. Those creditors are threatening him with severe consequences if he does not produce the $15 million in assets within 60 days. That is the entire reason he launched this fraudulent lawsuit against me. Darius paused, his hand resting on the handle of his briefcase. And you are going to pay off his debt. I am not paying off his debt, Darius, I said, a cold, harsh light flashing in my eyes. I am purchasing his debt. I tapped the screen of my phone, initiating a highly secure encrypted communication channel with my lead offshore financial manager based in Zurich. I quickly typed out a set of explicit instructions authorizing a massive transfer of capital. I am establishing an anonymous blind trust, I explained to Darius as I finalized the financial directive. My wealth managers are going to quietly approach Elijah's underground creditors tomorrow morning. Those shadow lenders want their money back, and they do not care who it comes from. My blind trust will offer to buy Elijah's entire $15 million debt portfolio in cash at a slight premium. The creditors will happily sell the debt and transfer all the collection rights directly to my anonymous trust. Darius stared at me in stunned silence. The sheer scale of the retaliation was finally dawning on him. You are going to become your brother's sole creditor. Yes, I confirmed, hitting the send button on my phone and watching the secure message encrypt and disappear into the digital ether. Once my blind trust owns the $15 million debt, I am going to legally assign that debt directly to the Vanguard Biotech Operating Company. I will attach it to the corporate ledger right before our final court hearing on Friday. The pieces of the masterstroke were perfectly aligned. The trap was meticulously set. Elijah and Valerie were walking into a financial slaughterhouse entirely of their own making. They were relying on a corrupt judge to hand them a $24 million empire. Instead, they were going to receive a legally binding death sentence. When Judge Sterling forces me to sign over the company, I will hand Valerie the keys to an empty shell. I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. The holding company in Delaware will instantly revoke all product rights, stripping the operating company of its entire value. And simultaneously, the new owners will trigger the assumption of debt clause, making them entirely responsible for the $15 million owed to my anonymous trust. Darius let out a dark, echoing laugh that filled the soundproof conference room. They are going to walk into that courtroom expecting to become multimillionaires, and they are going to walk out personally liable for a $15 million debt to a creditor they cannot even identify. It is absolute legal perfection, Simone. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, feeling a profound sense of cold satisfaction wash over my entire body. I had survived their abuse, their gaslighting, and their financial theft for decades. But the era of the quiet, obedient scapegoat was officially over. My family wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate warfare. They were about to learn that I wrote the rules. Let us see how much they love Vanguard Biotech when it comes with a $15 million price tag. Darius had explicitly warned me not to communicate with my family outside of formal legal channels. But when Pastor Harrison's personal assistant called my direct line the night before the final court hearing, requesting my presence at the Atlanta Heritage Country Club, I knew exactly what they were trying to do. It was a classic, deeply predictable move. They believed they had me completely cornered. Judge Sterling was holding my entire $24 million company hostage, and my parents assumed I was currently living in a dingy motel room, terrified and entirely broken. They wanted to stage a grand public performance of familial reconciliation, but the actual underlying objective was pure, unadulterated psychological warfare. They wanted to humiliate me one last time before they officially stole my empire tomorrow morning. I arrived at the country club at precisely 7 o'clock. The dining room was an opulent display of excessive wealth, with heavy crystal chandeliers, casting a warm golden glow over the crisp white linen tablecloths. My family had secured a private dining alcove slightly elevated above the main floor, so that passing members of their mega-church congregation could clearly see them actively demonstrating Christian forgiveness. I approached the table with a perfectly composed, deeply unbothered expression. Pastor Harrison sat at the head of the table, radiating smug patriarchal authority. First Lady Vivian sat to his right, wearing a silk blouse and her trademark string of expensive pearls. Elijah and Valerie sat opposite them, both practically vibrating with poorly concealed triumphant greed. "Simone," my father said, gesturing vaguely toward the empty chair at the end of the table. "Have a seat. We ordered the filet mignon. I know you cannot afford to eat like this anymore, so please enjoy the meal." I sat down, smoothing my napkin over my lap. "Thank you, Pastor Harrison," I replied, keeping my voice completely neutral. "I assume we are not here simply to enjoy the cuisine." My mother leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly as she adopted her most patronizing, deeply condescending tone. "We are here, Simone, because despite your terrible rebellious behavior, you are still blood. Your father and I have prayed extensively over your current situation. We have asked God to soften your hardened heart and to show you the error of your selfish, aggressive ways. The Lord strips the arrogant of their wealth to humble them, Simone. You built that little lotion company with too much pride, and now the legal system is rightfully returning those assets to the family structure where they belong." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I simply picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip, maintaining absolute, unbreakable eye contact with her. Elijah cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Look, Simone, we do not want to see you completely destitute," he said, offering a fake, magnanimous smile that made my stomach turn. "Once the judge officially signs the transfer orders tomorrow and Valerie and I take total control of Vanguard Biotech, we are going to restructure the executive board immediately, but we are willing to offer you a small severance package, enough to cover your rent at that motel for a few months until you find another job." Valerie let out a sharp, malicious laugh, resting her elbows on the heavy oak table. "Oh, Elijah, do not be so generous," she sneered, her eyes flashing with pure, unadulterated malice. She turned her venomous gaze directly toward me. "Do not worry, Simone. I am actually willing to hire you back as a lab tech. You are very good at mixing lotions in a back room. You are just clearly not cut out to be a real corporate leader. You do not have the vision or the pedigree to run a multi-million-dollar brand. I will let you keep working in the lab, but you will report directly to me." I picked up my steak knife and fork, carefully cutting a small, precise piece of the filet mignon. I chewed it slowly, swallowing before I finally spoke. My voice was calm, pleasant, and entirely devoid of the anger they were so desperately trying to provoke. "That is incredibly generous of you, Valerie," I said, offering her a polite, almost cheerful smile. "But I think you and Elijah are going to be far too busy managing the complex corporate structure of Vanguard Biotech to worry about employing me. I genuinely hope the two of you enjoy every single liability that comes with being a chief executive officer." Valerie frowned deeply, her perfectly arched eyebrows drawing together in sudden confusion. She completely missed the lethal double meaning hidden perfectly within my words. She thought I was simply acknowledging defeat, but she had absolutely no idea that I had just signed her financial death warrant. My father raised his wine glass, his chest puffed out with arrogant absolute certainty. "Let us toast to the restoration of family order," he proclaimed, his voice carrying out into the main dining room. To Elijah and Valerie, the new legal owners of Vanguard Biotech, and to Simone for finally learning her proper place in this family. I raised my water glass, tapping it gently against his crystal goblet. To the new owners, I repeated softly, my smile never once reaching my eyes. May your reign be exactly what you deserve. I finished my meal in relative silence, allowing them to bask in their profound ignorance. I listened to Elijah brag about the new luxury vehicles he was planning to buy once he liquidated my corporate accounts. I listened to Valerie discuss the expensive interior designers she was going to hire to remodel my corporate headquarters. I listened to my parents praise them both, completely blind to the fact that they were actively celebrating a $15 million federal trap. When the dessert plates were cleared away, I politely excused myself from the table. I walked out of the country club, breathing in the warm, humid Atlanta air. The psychological warfare they had attempted to inflict upon me had failed completely. They wanted to break my spirit, but they had only hardened my absolute resolve. I drove back to my temporary motel room and immediately called Darius. "Is everything prepared?" I asked, as soon as he answered the phone. "The trap is fully armed and completely hidden within the transfer documents." Darius confirmed, his voice crackling with dark professional anticipation. "The Delaware Holding Company termination clauses are embedded in Section 4. The immediate assumption of debt clause is buried in Section 9. I have also received the secure confirmation from your offshore trust. Your blind trust is now the sole legal owner of Elijah's $15 million debt portfolio, and we have formally assigned that entire debt directly to the Vanguard Biotech operating company ledger. The trap will spring the absolute second they sign the papers tomorrow morning." "Excellent," I replied, staring at the cracked ceiling of the motel room. "Tomorrow we let them win." The following morning, I arrived at the Fulton County Superior Court wearing a simple, unbranded black suit. The heavy marble corridors were echoing with the sounds of lawyers and clients, but my focus was entirely singular. I walked into courtroom 4B and immediately felt the hostile, oppressive atmosphere. My mother had apparently invited several prominent members of their megachurch congregation to witness my public humiliation. They filled the wooden benches in the gallery, whispering and pointing as I walked down the center aisle. Pastor Harrison and First Lady Vivian sat in the front row, dressed in their absolute Sunday best, their faces glowing with righteous satisfaction. Elijah and Valerie sat at the plaintiff's table, looking like they had already won the lottery. Darius sat beside me at the defense table, his posture relaxed, his expression a mask of cold, unreadable professionalism. "We are not going to object to anything," he whispered, leaning close to my ear. We let Sterling do exactly what he was paid to do. A heavy silence descended over the courtroom as the bailiff announced the arrival of the judge. "All rise." Judge Warren Sterling walked out from his chambers, his black robe billowing behind him. He took his seat at the elevated bench, his eyes scanning the courtroom before settling directly on me. He did not look like an impartial arbiter of justice. He looked like a corrupt, arrogant man who believed he was completely untouchable. "Let us conclude this matter swiftly." Judge Sterling began, his voice dripping with condescension. "I have reviewed the filings regarding the ownership dispute of Vanguard Biotech. Miss Vanguard, your defense counsel submitted a packet of financial documents yesterday, claiming you built this company independently. I have reviewed them and found them to be entirely unconvincing and largely irrelevant to the core issue of family capital contribution." Darius did not object. He simply sat back in his chair, observing the blatant judicial corruption unfold exactly as we had predicted. Based on the evidence presented by the plaintiffs, Judge Sterling continued, leaning forward and pointing a stern finger at me. "I find that you willfully and maliciously manipulated your family to secure the initial funding for this enterprise. I find that the intellectual property was developed using family resources and therefore rightfully belongs to the family estate managed by your brother." Valerie let out a sharp, audible breath of victory. Elijah smiled broadly, turning to look back at our parents, who were nodding in solemn agreement. Therefore, Judge Sterling concluded, raising his heavy wooden gavel, I am ordering you, Simone Vanguard, to immediately sign over 100% of your shares in the operating company known as Vanguard Biotech to the plaintiffs Elijah and Valerie Vanguard. You will surrender all corporate control, all physical assets, and all associated corporate bank accounts effective immediately. If you refuse to sign these transfer documents right here and right now, I will hold you in contempt of court and you will be taken into custody. He slammed the gavel down, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the silent courtroom. The bailiff walked over to the plaintiff's table, retrieved a thick stack of legal transfer documents from Elijah's attorney, and brought them over to our table. He placed them directly in front of me. Valerie leaned over the wooden divider separating our tables. She pulled a pristine silver Mont Blanc pen from her designer purse and slid it across the table toward me. Her eyes were wide with malicious, triumphant glee. "Sign it, drop out," she whispered, her voice a vicious, venomous hiss. "You were born to be nothing but garbage in this family, and now it is time for you to go back to the trash where you belong. Sign the company over to your betters." I looked down at the documents. I did not cry. I did not beg for mercy. I did not look back at my parents who were watching me with cold, unfeeling judgment. I picked up the silver pen. I flipped to the final page of the transfer agreement right where Darius had placed the signature line. I signed my name with a dramatic, beautiful, flowing flourish. I slid the documents back to the bailiff who carried them up to the judge's bench. Judge Sterling quickly reviewed the signature, a look of profound relief washing over his face. He had secured his offshore kickbacks. He had protected his illegal money laundering operation. The court acknowledges the legal transfer of Vanguard Biotech to the plaintiffs. Judge Sterling announced, a smug, satisfied smile spreading across his face. This matter is officially concluded. He raised his gavel, preparing to dismiss the court. "Before you strike that gavel, Your Honor," I said, my voice ringing out clear, strong, and absolutely commanding. The entire courtroom froze. I stood up from the defense table, buttoning my suit jacket and turning to face Valerie and Elijah directly. "I have a strict fiduciary duty under federal corporate law to fully inform the new controlling owners of Vanguard Biotech of their active immediate liabilities." Valerie's smug smile faltered slightly. "Liability," she repeated, confusion clouding her eyes. I gestured to Darius, who immediately powered on a small projector connected to his laptop. The bright screen illuminated the blank wall of the courtroom, displaying a massive, highly detailed flowchart of my corporate structure. "Congratulations, Valerie," I said, my voice echoing through the stunned silence of the courtroom. "You and Elijah just legally forced a hostile transfer of control. You are now the proud official owners of Vanguard Biotech. But unfortunately for you, Vanguard Biotech is nothing more than an empty operating shell." Judge Sterling frowned, leaning over his bench. "What are you talking about, Miss Vanguard?" "I am talking about corporate law, Your Honor," I replied, stepping out from behind the defense table. "Vanguard Biotech does not own a single patent. It does not own a single skincare formula, a single manufacturing contract, or a single trademark. Every piece of intellectual property that gives that company its $24 million valuation is actually owned entirely by a separate, anonymous holding company incorporated in the state of Delaware, a holding company that I control 100%. The color began to rapidly drain from Elijah's face. He looked frantically at his own attorney, who was furiously flipping through the transfer documents I had just signed, trying to find the trap. "Vanguard Biotech merely leases the rights to use my intellectual property," I continued, my voice rising with cold, undeniable authority. "And if you had bothered to read the deeply embedded bylaws you just signed, Valerie, you would know that upon any hostile transfer of control via a court order, all existing licensing agreements immediately and permanently terminate." I paused, letting the absolute devastation of my words sink into their greedy, arrogant minds. "You do not own an empire, Valerie," I said, staring directly into her terrified eyes. "You own a completely worthless shell company that no longer has the legal right to manufacture, sell, or distribute a single bottle of product. Your new company has absolutely zero assets. But it gets much, much better." I continued, a dark, lethal smile finally breaking across my face. Because under Section 9 of the transfer documents you just signed, you also triggered the immediate assumption of debt clause. Vanguard Biotech just absorbed a massive external debt portfolio, a debt portfolio that I purchased through an anonymous blind trust exactly 5 days ago. Elijah stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the floor. His hands were shaking violently. "What does that mean?" he stammered, his voice cracking with pure panic. "What debt?" I turned to look directly at my brother, my eyes blazing with the fury of a decade of abuse. "It means—" "Elijah," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper that echoed through the dead silent courtroom. "It means that you and your wife are now personally, legally, and financially liable for the $15 million in federal debt you owe to my anonymous trust. And since your real estate firm is bankrupt and your bank accounts are currently at zero, I will be seizing everything you own to collect it." Valerie let out a sharp, horrifying gasp, dropping the silver pen as if it had suddenly caught fire. The gavel slipped from Judge Sterling's sweating hand, clattering loudly onto the floor. The trap had sprung, and there was absolutely no escape. The morning sun beat down on the heavy marble pillars of the Fulton County Superior Court, but I felt absolutely nothing but a deep, icy calm. Today was the day my family believed they were going to legally execute my independence. I walked up the wide concrete steps, wearing a sharply tailored dark charcoal suit that commanded respect without screaming for attention. Darius walked perfectly in step beside me, his heavy leather briefcase carrying the explosive legal documents that would soon turn this entire courthouse into a financial slaughterhouse. We pushed through the heavy wooden doors and made our way down the long, echoing corridor toward courtroom 4B. I knew my mother had orchestrated a grand spectacle, but seeing the reality of it still made my stomach turn with deep disgust. First Lady Vivian had essentially turned a high-stakes corporate hearing into a mega-church social event. The gallery was absolutely packed, shoulder to shoulder with the most prominent members of Atlanta's black elite. I saw wealthy deacons, socialite wives, political donors, and real estate moguls whispering behind their manicured hands as I walked down the center aisle. My mother had clearly spent the last 3 days working her extensive phone tree, inviting every single influential person she knew to come and witness my public humiliation. She wanted them to watch the rebellious, ugly duckling daughter get legally stripped of her unearned wealth. She wanted to prove to the entire city that the Vanguard family hierarchy was absolute and unbreakable. Pastor Harrison and First Lady Vivian sat dead center in the front row right behind the plaintiff's table. They were dressed in matching royal blue ensembles, looking like they were attending a royal coronation rather than a legal proceeding. My mother caught my eye and offered a tight, patronizing smile that was meant to convey deep Christian pity, but practically vibrated with malicious anticipation. My father simply adjusted his silver-topped cane and looked away, refusing to even acknowledge my humanity. At the plaintiff's table, my older brother Elijah and his wife Valerie were already seated and whispering animatedly to their high-priced corporate attorney. Elijah was wearing a custom-tailored pinstripe suit, his hair perfectly faded, looking every inch the visionary businessman he so desperately pretended to be. He was secretly drowning in $15 million of dangerous underground debt, but he masked his sheer panic behind a thick veneer of arrogant confidence. Valerie was wearing a bright crimson dress that was entirely too flashy for a courtroom. When she saw me take my seat at the defense table, she leaned back in her chair and smirked, running a hand over her flawless extensions. She believed she was minutes away from becoming a multi-millionaire cosmetics queen. Darius sat down beside me and slowly unpacked his files. He did not pull out thick stacks of defensive evidence. He only pulled out the final transfer documents. "We are not going to object to a single word," he whispered, leaning in close so the surrounding gallery could not hear our strategy. "We are going to let Judge Sterling do exactly what he was paid to do. We sit here, we take the verbal abuse, and we hand them the poison pill on a silver platter. Do not let them see you sweat, Simone." "I am not sweating, Darius," I whispered back, keeping my posture rigidly straight. "I am just waiting for the exact right moment to drop the match." A heavy, oppressive silence suddenly descended over the packed courtroom as the heavy wooden door beside the bench swung open. All rise, the bailiff announced in a loud, booming voice. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Warren Sterling presiding. Judge Sterling walked out from his private chambers, his black judicial robe billowing behind him like a dark cloud. He was a towering, imposing man, with a reputation for merciless rulings and an undeniable presence in the elite social circles of the city. He took his seat at the elevated bench, folding his hands together and looking out over the courtroom. His eyes swept past the packed gallery, offering a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of recognition to my father in the front row. They were fraternity brothers, bound by decades of secrets and financial favors. Sterling was not here to dispense justice. He was here to protect his offshore kickbacks and save his godson Elijah from total financial ruin. Be seated, Judge Sterling commanded, his deep voice echoing through the silent room. We are here to conclude the emergency injunction and ownership dispute regarding the corporate entity known as Vanguard Biotech. I have reviewed the preliminary motions and I am prepared to issue my final ruling on this matter. Darius stood up slightly. Your Honor, the defense submitted a final comprehensive financial packet yesterday afternoon containing fully audited bank records proving that my client built this company with zero family capital. Judge Sterling waved his hand dismissively, batting the statement away as if it were a minor, annoying insect. I saw your packet, counselor, and I found it to be entirely unconvincing. In fact, I found it to be a deliberate, manipulative attempt to obscure the truth of this familial dispute. You may sit down. I have heard enough from the defense. Darius gave me a brief, knowing look before slowly taking his seat. The fix was in, and it was completely transparent. Judge Sterling leaned forward, resting his elbows on the heavy oak bench and focusing his cold, judging eyes directly on me. Miss Vanguard, he began, his tone dripping with heavy, condescending disdain. This court has very little patience for individuals who exploit the generosity of their own flesh and blood. The evidence presented by your brother clearly demonstrates that the foundation of your business was built upon the financial resources and the intellectual capital of your family estate. I sat perfectly still, my face a mask of stone. He was literally making up the law as he went along, fabricating a narrative out of thin air to justify his blatant theft. You took advantage of a family loan. Judge Sterling continued, his voice rising in righteous theatrical indignation. You utilized the prestigious Vanguard name to open doors in this city that would have otherwise remained firmly shut to a young, inexperienced woman with no college degree. Your brother Elijah, acting as the diligent steward of the family assets, provided the initial vision for this enterprise. Instead of honoring that investment, you chose the path of greed. You attempted to sever ties with your own parents and hoard the immense profits for yourself. That type of deceitful, arrogant behavior will not be tolerated in my courtroom. A low murmur of approval rippled through the gallery behind me. I could hear my mother letting out a soft, dramatic sigh of vindicated suffering. She was putting on a masterclass performance for her wealthy church friends, pretending to be the heartbroken mother of a treacherous, greedy daughter. Elijah sat up straighter, pushing his chest out and looking at me with a sickening expression of false pity. He was eating up every single word of the judge's corrupt speech. He truly believed he had outsmarted me. He believed his fraternity connections and his golden child status were powerful enough to overwrite reality itself. Therefore, Judge Sterling declared, his voice booming with final, absolute authority. I am ruling fully in favor of the plaintiffs. I am ordering you, Simone Vanguard, to immediately and unconditionally sign over 100% of your controlling shares in the operating company known as Vanguard Biotech to your brother Elijah Vanguard and his wife Valerie Vanguard. The courtroom held its breath. The silence was so absolute I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. You will surrender all corporate control, all physical assets, all distribution rights, and all associated corporate bank accounts effective immediately, Judge Sterling demanded, glaring down at me with unchecked hostility. And let me be absolutely clear, Miss Vanguard. If you refuse to sign these legal transfer documents right here and right now, I will hold you in direct contempt of court. I will have the bailiff place you in handcuffs, and you will be remanded to the county jail until you decide to comply with my judicial order. Do you understand me? I looked up at the corrupt man sitting on the bench. I understood him perfectly. I understood that he was digging his own grave right alongside my greedy, treacherous family. I understand, Your Honor, I replied, my voice completely steady and totally devoid of fear. Judge Sterling nodded, a smug, satisfied smile creeping onto his face. He struck his heavy wooden gavel against the sound block, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. The ruling is final. Bailiff, present the transfer documents to the defendant for immediate signature. The uniformed bailiff walked over to the plaintiff's table, where Elijah's highly paid corporate attorney handed him a thick stack of pristine legal documents. The bailiff carried the heavy stack across the room and placed it directly on the defense table right in front of me. I looked down at the documents. The top page had a single blank line waiting for my signature. The line that would officially strip me of the company I had built from nothing. The line that would legally hand a $24 million empire over to the people who had abused and belittled me my entire life. Suddenly, I heard the scraping of a wooden chair. I looked up to see Valerie standing from the plaintiff's table. She ignored court decorum and walked slowly, deliberately over to my table. The judge did not stop her. He allowed her this moment of triumphant gloating. Valerie stopped right in front of me, leaning her hands on the heavy wooden divider that separated us. She looked down at me, her eyes gleaming with a toxic, intoxicating mixture of sheer malice and pure, unadulterated victory. She reached into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out a pristine, heavy silver Mont Blanc pen. She slowly slid the expensive pen across the polished wood of the table until it stopped right next to the legal documents. "Sign it, drop out," she whispered, her voice a vicious, venomous hiss that only I could hear. "You were born to be nothing but a dirty, ugly little secret in this family, and now it is time for you to go back to the trash where you belong. You thought you could be better than us, you thought you could humiliate me. But look at you now. You have absolutely nothing. Sign the company over to your betters." I looked at the silver pen. I looked at Valerie's triumphant, smirking face. I looked back at my parents in the front row, watching me with cold, unfeeling judgment. They were all waiting for me to break. They were waiting for the tears to fall. They were waiting for me to beg for mercy, to apologize for my arrogance, to ask them for a small job in the lab just so I could survive. I did not cry. I did not beg. I felt a surge of absolute glorious power radiating through my veins. I picked up the heavy silver Mont Blanc pen. I flipped past the cover page directly to the final signature page of the binding transfer agreement. I found the exact paragraph where Darius had buried the lethal corporate poison pill. I did not hesitate for a single second. I pressed the tip of the pen to the paper and signed my name with a dramatic, beautiful, flowing flourish. I capped the pen and set it down. I picked up the thick stack of signed legal documents and slid them smoothly across the table back toward the waiting bailiff. I looked up at the corrupt judge sitting on his elevated throne, and I smiled. It was a cold, dark, terrifying smile. "It is done, Your Honor," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the massive, silent room. The trap was officially closed. The countdown to their total financial annihilation had just begun. Judge Warren Sterling raised his heavy wooden gavel high into the air, preparing to strike the sounding block and dismiss the court. A collective sigh of relief and victory rippled through the packed gallery. My mother, First Lady. Vivian leaned back against the wooden bench, her face glowing with righteous vindication. My father, Pastor Harrison, offered a slow, approving nod to my brother Elijah. At the plaintiff's table, Valerie reached out and placed her manicured hand over Elijah's, practically vibrating with the thrill of becoming a multimillionaire. They thought the war was over. They thought they had entirely broken me. "Before you strike that gavel, Your Honor," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the courtroom like a sharpened blade. I stood up slowly from the defense table, buttoning my charcoal suit jacket. "I have a strict fiduciary duty under federal corporate law to fully inform the new controlling owners of Vanguard Biotech of their active immediate liabilities." Judge Sterling froze, his gavel hovering uselessly in the air. He frowned, his thick gray eyebrows drawing together in sudden confusion. Liabilities, he echoed, his tone dripping with immediate suspicion. What exactly are you talking about, Miss Vanguard? This case is officially closed. You just signed the transfer documents. I am talking about corporate transparency, Your Honor, I replied, stepping out from behind the heavy wooden defense table and walking deliberately toward the center of the room. Valerie scoffed, rolling her eyes and leaning back in her designer chair. Let it go, Simone, she sneered, her voice echoing slightly in the large space. You lost. Stop embarrassing yourself and leave our company premises immediately. I ignored her entirely. I turned my attention to Darius, who was already standing. He efficiently powered on a small high-resolution projector connected directly to his encrypted laptop. A massive bright image appeared on the blank white wall. The entire gallery gasped as a complex corporate organizational chart illuminated the room. It was a labyrinth of interconnected boxes and legal entities perfectly designed to shield my true wealth from predators exactly like my family. Congratulations, Valerie, I said, projecting my voice so every single elite member of my parents' megachurch could hear me clearly. You and Elijah just successfully utilized a corrupt legal maneuver to force a hostile transfer of control. You are now the proud official owners of Vanguard Biotech. But unfortunately, for both of you, Vanguard Biotech is absolutely nothing more than an empty operating shell. It has zero intrinsic value. Elijah sat up straight, his charismatic smile instantly vanishing. What do you mean, an empty shell? He demanded, his voice cracking slightly. We just saw the financial audits. The company is valued at $24 million. It generates massive quarterly profits. I offered him a cold, merciless smile. That valuation was based on the exclusive legal right to manufacture and distribute the product line Elijah. I explained, pacing slowly in front of the projected corporate chart. But Vanguard Biotech does not actually own a single patent. It does not own a single proprietary skincare formula. It does not own the manufacturing contracts. It does not even own the trademarked name, Vanguard Biotech. I continued, watching the color rapidly drain from Valerie's perfectly contoured face. Every single piece of intellectual property that gives that business its massive valuation is actually owned entirely by a separate anonymous holding company incorporated in the strict privacy state of Delaware. And I personally control 100% of the shares in that Delaware holding company. The operating company you just stole merely leased the rights to use my property. Judge Sterling slammed his gavel down against the block, causing several people in the front row to jump. This is outrageous, he bellowed, his face turning an angry shade of crimson. If you are deliberately withholding corporate assets to defy a direct court order, I will have you arrested for fraud immediately. I turned to face the angry judge, maintaining absolute, unbreakable composure. There is absolutely no fraud here, Your Honor, I stated firmly. The structural arrangement has been on file with the federal government for 5 years. My attorney submitted the full corporate bylaws to this very court yesterday afternoon. Perhaps if you had bothered to actually read the defense packet instead of blindly handing my company over to your fraternity brother, you would have noticed the hostile transfer clause. I said, my words striking the judge like physical blows. He recoiled, sinking back into his heavy leather chair. I turned my attention back to my brother and his terrified wife. If you look at Section 4 of the transfer documents you just eagerly forced me to sign, Valerie, you will see the exact terms of the intellectual property lease I instructed. It explicitly states that upon any involuntary hostile transfer of control, all existing licensing agreements are immediately and permanently terminated. A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the courtroom. The wealthy socialites and church deacons in the gallery stared in absolute stunned disbelief. My mother clutched her string of expensive pearls, her mouth hanging open. My father looked physically ill. You do not own an empire, Valerie, I said, my voice ringing with cold, undeniable authority. You own a completely worthless corporate shell that no longer possesses the legal right to manufacture, sell, or distribute a single bottle of lotion. Your new company has absolutely zero income and absolutely zero assets. You fought a brutal legal war just to win an empty cardboard box. Valerie stared at the signed transfer documents resting on the table in front of her as if they had suddenly turned into venomous snakes. She dropped the pristine silver Mont Blanc pen, her hands trembling violently. But it gets much better. I continued, allowing a dark, lethal smile to break across my face. Because an empty box is simply not enough of a punishment for what you two have done to me. I gestured toward Darius, who clicked a button on his laptop, instantly changing the projected image to a massive glowing financial ledger filled with red negative numbers. Under Section 9 of those exact same transfer documents, you triggered the immediate assumption of debt clause. I announced, my voice echoing powerfully off the marble walls. When you forcefully took ownership of the operating shell, you also legally absorbed all of its active corporate liabilities. And just yesterday afternoon, Vanguard Biotech officially assumed a massive external debt portfolio. Elijah leaped to his feet, his chair scraping harshly against the polished wooden floor. What debt? He screamed, his chest heaving with pure, unrestrained panic. What are you talking about? Simone? Vanguard Biotech does not have any debt. It was a completely profitable enterprise. It did not have debt until I attached your debt to the corporate ledger, Elijah, I replied, stepping dangerously close to the wooden divider separating our tables. You thought you could use my successful company to pay off the dangerous underground creditors you owe $15 million to. You thought you could embezzle charity funds from the church and then steal my life's work to cover up your massive federal crimes. The gallery erupted into shocked, chaotic gasps. My father covered his face with his hands, realizing his golden sun was entirely exposed. I authorized my anonymous offshore blind trust to quietly purchase your entire $15 million debt portfolio from those ruthless venture capitalists last week. I revealed, watching Elijah's knees buckle slightly. They happily sold the collection rights directly to me. I am now your sole creditor, Elijah. And I immediately assigned that entire $15 million debt directly to the Vanguard Biotech operating shell right before you stole it. Valerie let out a sharp, horrifying gasp, staring at the signed paper as if it were entirely engulfed in flames. Elijah gripped the edge of the heavy wooden table, his knuckles turning completely white. He looked frantically at his highly paid corporate attorney, who was furiously flipping through the signed transfer documents, completely unable to find any legal loophole to save them. The attorney slowly lowered the documents, shaking his head in absolute defeat. What does that mean? Elijah stammers, his voice cracking with pure terror. He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading desperately, searching the room for the quiet, obedient little sister he had bullied and manipulated his entire life. But that quiet sister was truly dead. She had been completely burned away by their endless greed and their vicious cruelty. I stood perfectly still, letting the absolute weight of their total destruction settle heavily over the crowded courtroom. I offered him a calm, polite smile that did not reach my eyes. It means you two are now completely and personally liable for $15 million in corporate debt, I said smoothly, watching the exact moment his entire arrogant world shattered into a million tiny, irreparable pieces right before my very own eyes. And your bank accounts are currently sitting exactly at zero. The absolute silence in courtroom 4B was deafening. It was not the respectful quiet of a legal proceeding, but the breathless, terrified hush of a room witnessing a total execution. Valerie stared at the signed transfer document resting on the polished wooden table. Her manicured fingers hovered over the thick paper, trembling so violently that her heavy diamond rings clattered against the surface. She dropped the document as if the pages had suddenly erupted into scorching flames. She stumbled backward, her chair scraping harshly against the floor, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw oxygen into her lungs now. Elijah was completely paralyzed. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but absolutely no sound emerged. The arrogant visionary CEO persona had evaporated entirely, leaving behind a terrified little boy staring into the abyss of a massive $15 million financial grave. He looked at his high-priced corporate attorney, desperately, silently begging for a legal miracle. His attorney simply looked away, packing his heavy leather briefcase with deliberate speed, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the catastrophic liability that had just materialized. Up on the elevated bench, Judge Warren Sterling finally realized the sheer magnitude of this total disaster unfolding. The color drained from his face rapidly, leaving his skin a sickly ash gray. His dark eyes darted wildly around the courtroom, scanning the faces of the elite gallery before locking onto me with a mixture of absolute panic and unadulterated fury. He had thought he was orchestrating a clean corporate theft for his fraternity brother. He had thought he was securing a massive payday for himself. Instead, he had just handed his godson a financial death sentence on public record. "This is an outrage," Judge Sterling bellowed, his deep voice cracking slightly as pure panic fully set in immediately. He grabbed his heavy wooden gavel and began striking the sound block with chaotic, aggressive force. "Order in this court. I demand order immediately. Miss Vanguard, you have deliberately misled this court. You have intentionally weaponized corporate bylaws to sabotage a judicial decree. I will not allow this mockery of the justice system to stand in my courtroom." I did not flinch. I stood perfectly still, my posture radiating absolute, unshakable calm. I simply watched him flail. "I invalidate this transfer!" Judge Sterling screamed, pointing his gavel directly at my face, his hand shaking visibly while glaring with pure hatred. "I am striking this entire proceeding from the official record. The transfer is void. The assumption of debt is void. You are in direct criminal contempt of this court, Miss Vanguard. This is blatant financial fraud." The gallery erupted into a cacophony of shocked whispers and fearful murmurs. The wealthy socialites and powerful deacons who had come to witness my public humiliation were now leaning forward in their wooden pews, absolutely captivated by the total destruction of the Vanguard family facade. My mother, First Lady. Vivian gripped the edge of the wooden barrier separating the gallery from the wide well. Her knuckles turned completely white. Her perfectly composed face was now twisted into a mask of pure terror. My father, Pastor Harrison, sat rigidly beside her, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths, his eyes fixed on the judge in silent, desperate panic. I slowly reached into my leather briefcase resting on the defense table. I did not pull out another legal motion. I did not pull out a defensive financial audit. I pulled out a single thick red folder. The bright crimson color seemed to glow under the harsh fluorescent lights of the large, busy modern courtroom. "You cannot invalidate it, Warren," I said, my voice dropping the formal title entirely. The disrespect echoed through the massive room like a physical blow. "The transfer is legally binding, executed under your direct judicial order, and witnessed by a courtroom full of your closest personal friends. But more importantly, you cannot invalidate it because you have absolutely no judicial authority left." Judge Sterling froze. His gavel hung suspended in the air. "How dare you address me that way?" he hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of rage and sudden undeniable fear creeping over his aged, pale features. Bailiff, prepare to take the defendant into custody. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the center aisle, holding the thick red folder up for the entire room to see. "I am not committing fraud, Warren," I declared, my voice ringing with cold, lethal precision. "I am simply following the money. Just like you cannot invalidate the transfer documents, you also cannot invalidate the $2 million in illegal kickbacks you received directly from the Vanguard Family Church Charity Fund." A collective gasp ripped through the packed gallery. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated, total, and absolute profound shock. The air in the room instantly grew heavy, thick with the suffocating weight of absolute scandal. My father let out a sharp, choking sound, gripping his chest as if he had been physically struck. "What are you talking about?" Elijah stammered, finally finding his voice, his eyes darting frantically between me and the judge. I opened the red folder, peeling back the curtain on their entire criminal enterprise. "I am talking about the offshore laundering operation, Elijah," I said, turning my piercing gaze toward my highly terrified, absolutely ruined older golden brother standing there looking completely pathetic and utterly helpless. I am talking about the exact method you used to siphon millions of dollars from the church congregation to pay off your underground venture capitalists. You did not do it alone. You had high-level legal protection. Judge Sterling's face shifted from ash gray to a deep, mottled purple. "Shut your mouth!" he roared, slamming his hands flat against the bench. "Do not speak another word." I ignored him completely, turning my attention to the elite audience sitting in the gallery. These were the people who had funded my parents' lavish, decadent, and incredibly expensive grand social elite country lifestyle. These were the people who had donated their hard-earned money to build community centers and fund youth scholarships. It was time for them to hear exactly where their faith had been invested. On October 12th of last year, I read loudly, my voice echoing off the marble walls. $250,000 was wired from the primary Vanguard Church charity account to a shell corporation named Apex Holdings. Apex Holdings is registered in the state of Delaware, but operates exclusively through a proxy firm. 3 days later, that exact same amount was rapidly wired very secretly offshore. Minus a 5% transfer fee, it was deposited into a private secured account in the Cayman Islands. Lies, my mother shrieked from the front row, standing up, her voice cracking with hysteria. "She is making this up to destroy us. Do not listen to her." On November 18th, I continued, my voice slicing through her panic effortlessly. Another $400,000 was transferred using the exact same routing method. And on January 5th, an additional $600,000. The pattern is consistent, deliberate, and completely illegal. Every single wire transfer corresponds perfectly with the quarterly interest payments. Payments Elijah owed to his underground creditors. The courtroom was descending into absolute chaos. Deacons were whispering furiously to one another. Wealthy donors were staring at my parents with expressions of profound disgust and rising fury. The pristine, flawless reputation of the Vanguard megachurch was disintegrating in real time, crumbling into a pile of radioactive ash right before their very eyes. And the Cayman Island Shell Company receiving the kickbacks for facilitating this massive embezzlement scheme, I announced, turning slowly back to face the bench, directly staring into Judge Sterling's, absolutely terrified, wide open, highly panicking dark brown eyes. "The offshore account is registered to a corporate entity named Sterling Consulting Limited. You sold your judicial oath, Warren. You protected Elijah's failing real estate firm. You granted emergency injunctions against me without evidence. You orchestrated this entire fraudulent lawsuit today just to force me to hand over Vanguard Biotech so Elijah could pay off his massive debt and keep your kickbacks flowing secretly." Judge Sterling was sweating profusely now. Heavy beads of perspiration rolled down his forehead, stinging his eyes. He wiped his face with a trembling hand, his chest heaving as the walls closed in all around him. He looked at my father, who was slumped forward in his seat, clutching his chest tightly, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "This is slander!" Judge Sterling screamed, pointing a shaking finger. "Bailiff, arrest her right now!" The uniformed bailiff took a deliberate step backward, shaking his head. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly swung open with a loud thud. A team of stern-faced men and women wearing dark tactical windbreakers marched aggressively down the center aisle. Bold yellow letters were printed across the backs of their jackets reading FBI and IRS agents. The agents did not hesitate. They moved with swift, terrifying precision, fanning out across the courtroom. 2 agents marched straight past the defense table and approached the elevated bench. Judge Warren Sterling scrambled backward, his heavy leather chair screeching against the wood. He threw up his hands, his face a mask of absolute horror, but the agents were already flanking him. They grabbed his arms, pulling him out of his seat. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the silent room. Warren Sterling, the man who had thought he was a god in his own courtroom, was unceremoniously read his rights and dragged down from his pedestal. Simultaneously, 3 more agents surrounded the plaintiff's table. Elijah tried to stand, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. An agent slammed him face first against the polished oak table, securing his wrists behind his back. Valerie let out a piercing shriek as a female agent grabbed her arms, forcing them together. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and tax evasion," the lead agent announced, his voice booming over the chaos. "You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it immediately." The reality of the situation finally broke through Valerie's delusions. The arrogant, untouchable pageant queen completely vanished. She dropped to her knees, her designer dress tearing against the hardwood floor. Thick streaks of black mascara ran down her perfectly contoured face, ruining her flawless aesthetic. "Simone," she sobbed, crawling toward my table, while the agent struggled to hold her back. "Simone, please tell them to stop. We did not mean it. We were just desperate. Please, you have to help me. I cannot go to federal prison. I will do anything you want." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. I did not move a single muscle. I simply stared at her tear-stained face, watching her experience the exact same helpless terror she had gleefully tried to inflict upon me just minutes earlier. It was a profoundly satisfying moment. Then a loud wail tore through the gallery. My mother, First Lady Vivian, scrambled out of the front row. She pushed past the stunned church deacons and wealthy socialites, throwing herself onto the floor right at my feet. She grabbed the hem of my suit pants, her hands shaking violently. "Simone, please," she wailed, abandoning all pretense of her elite stoic persona. "We are your family. You cannot do this to us. Look at what they are doing to your brother. Save him. Save your brother, please. He is your blood. You have the power to fix this terrible misunderstanding." I slowly reached down and pried her trembling fingers off my suit. I took a deliberate step back, distancing myself from the woman who had spent my entire life trying to destroy my spirit. The entire gallery of Atlanta's elite watched in stunned, breathless silence, completely captivated by the total destruction of the Vanguard family facade. "Family protects each other," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the courtroom, cold and unforgiving. "You threw me to the wolves the very moment you thought it would benefit you financially. You sat there and watched them try to steal my life's work. You smiled while they did it. So no, mother. I will not save him. And I will not save you. Enjoy selling your precious mansion to pay off the IRS. I hope the money is worth the price of your soul." I turned my back on them. I walked down the center aisle, my head held high, leaving them to the justice they had so desperately earned. The sound of their sobbing faded as the heavy courtroom doors closed behind me forever. 6 months later, the landscape of Atlanta's elite had completely changed. The Vanguard family empire was entirely eradicated. The federal investigation into the church charity fund triggered a massive, highly publicized audit of my parents' personal finances. The IRS seized everything they owned. Pastor Harrison and First Lady Vivian were forced to sell their mansion, their luxury cars, and their designer wardrobes just to keep themselves out of federal prison. They were publicly disgraced, completely bankrupted, and permanently socially exiled from the city. They currently live in a tiny, cramped apartment in a state they refuse to disclose. Elijah Valerie and Judge Warren Sterling were not so lucky. The federal prosecutors offered absolutely no leniency. All three of them pled guilty to avoid a drawn-out, humiliating public trial. They are currently serving long, consecutive federal sentences in a maximum security penitentiary. The underground creditors eventually wrote off Elijah's debt, realizing there was absolutely no blood left to squeeze from that particular stone. I am standing right now in the center of my brand new, massively expanded corporate headquarters. The massive glass windows look out over the glittering Atlanta skyline. After the trial, I officially rebranded my company. It is no longer associated with the Vanguard name. We are now known as Apex Biosolutions, and our current market valuation has officially doubled to $48 million. I am not standing in the shadows anymore. I am standing in the light, completely untouchable, entirely free and more powerful than they could have ever possibly imagined in their wildest, most greedy dreams. If you are watching this video right now, I truly want you to remember one very crucial, undeniable thing about life. Never, ever let anyone convince you that sharing blood means you have to silently share their toxicity. You absolutely do not owe your hard-earned success to the exact people who actively tried to ensure your failure. Let them dig their own graves. Hand them the shovel if you have to. Then simply turn around, walk away, and build your beautiful, successful empire right over it without looking back. Have you ever had to let a deeply toxic family member entirely destroy themselves? Tell me your story down in the comment section below this video.